The dark truth of the Chernobyl disaster. In the early hours of April 26, 1986, the world changed forever. A catastrophic explosion tore through Reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant in northern Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union. But what you think you know about Chernobyl is only the surface of a much darker, more disturbing truth. This is not just a story about a nuclear accident. This is a story about lies, cover-ups, human sacrifice, and secrets that governments desperately wanted to keep buried beneath tons of concrete and sand. The official narrative tells us that Chernobyl was a tragic accident caused by operator error during a safety test. We've been told that the Soviet government responded as best they could, that they evacuated people promptly, and that the disaster, while terrible, was contained. We've been assured that the area is now safe, that nature is reclaiming the exclusion zone, and that lessons were learned. But the real story of Chernobyl is far more sinister than any official report has ever acknowledged. It's a story written in the bodies of the dead, the dying, and the forgotten. It's a story of deliberate deception, criminal negligence, and the cold calculation that human lives are expendable when weighed against political reputation and economic concerns. The reactor didn't just explode that night. It continued burning for 10 days, spewing radioactive material across Europe and beyond. The graphite core, exposed to the air and burning at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, became a radioactive volcano. Every second, every minute, every hour that fire burned, it released more radiation into the atmosphere. Contemporary estimates suggest that the initial explosion and subsequent fire released over 50 million curies of radiation, though some scientists believe the actual number was far higher. To put this in perspective, that's approximately 400 times more radioactive fallout than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But here's what they didn't tell you. The Soviet government knew within hours that this was a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. They knew that massive amounts of radiation were spreading across their country and into neighboring nations. They knew that thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people needed to be evacuated immediately. And they did nothing. For nearly 36 hours, the people of Pripyat, the city built to house the power plant workers and their families, went about their daily lives. Children played in parks where invisible radioactive particles settled on playground equipment. People went to work, went shopping, breathed in air thick with radioactive isotopes. The radiation levels in Pripyat during those hours were lethal, yet no warning was given. The firefighters who responded to the initial blaze were sent to their deaths without being told what they were facing. They arrived in regular firefighting gear, completely unprotected against radiation. They picked up pieces of graphite from the reactor core with their bare hands, remarking on how strange it felt. That graphite was emitting radiation levels of 15,000 roentgens per hour. To understand how deadly this is, exposure to just 400 roentgens is fatal. These men were holding in their hands something that delivered that lethal dose in less than 2 minutes. Most of these firefighters were dead within weeks, their bodies so radioactive that they had to be buried in lead-lined coffins encased in concrete. The true horror of what these men endured has been sanitized in most accounts. The acute radiation syndrome they suffered doesn't just kill you. It destroys you from the inside out in the most agonizing way imaginable. First comes the initial phase, with nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Then, cruelly, there's a latent period where victims feel better, where hope emerges that maybe they'll survive. But this is just the calm before the storm. Then the real nightmare begins. The radiation has destroyed the bone marrow, the source of blood cells. The immune system collapses entirely. The gastrointestinal tract begins to disintegrate. The victims bleed internally from every organ. Their skin sloughs off in sheets. Their bodies literally cook from the inside as the radiation continues to destroy cellular structures. They die conscious, aware, in unspeakable agony, and there is nothing medical science can do except try to ease the pain. Lyudmila Ignatenko watched her husband, Vasily, one of the first firefighters on the scene, die this way. She was pregnant at the time, though she kept this secret from the medical staff. She stayed by his side, touching him, kissing him, loving him, even as doctors warned her not to get close. The radiation pouring from his body was so intense that he was essentially a radioactive source himself. She later gave birth to a daughter who lived only 4 hours, absorbing massive doses of radiation while still in the womb, acting as a shield that may have saved her mother's life. This is the human cost that statistics and official reports can never capture. But Vasily and his fellow firefighters were just the beginning. The Soviet government, desperate to contain the disaster and even more desperate to contain the information about the disaster, mobilized what they called the liquidators. This term, so clinical and cold, referred to the hundreds of thousands of men who were sent into the radioactive hell of Chernobyl to clean up the disaster. The official number is 600,000 liquidators. The real number is probably much higher, as many were never properly registered or documented. These men, mostly young conscripts and reservists, were told they were performing their patriotic duty. They were told the radiation levels were safe or manageable. They were lied to systematically and deliberately. Many were given dosimeters, devices to measure radiation exposure, that had been deliberately altered to show lower readings. Some were given dosimeters that didn't work at all. Others were given no protection whatsoever and told to work in areas where radiation levels were catastrophically high. The liquidators were tasked with impossible jobs. Some had to shovel radioactive debris from the roof of the reactor building. The radiation levels on that roof were so high that robots and remote-controlled vehicles, sent in first, had their electronics fried and ceased functioning. So instead, they sent men. Each worker was allowed 90 seconds on the roof. 90 seconds to run out, shovel radioactive material into the reactor hole, and run back. 90 seconds of exposure to radiation levels that exceeded what most nuclear workers receive in their entire careers. Many liquidators made multiple trips because there weren't enough men for the job, or because commanders, under pressure to work faster, ignored the safety protocols. Video footage exists of these men on the roof. You can watch them, moving in awkward, heavy lead suits that provided minimal protection, shoveling frantically, knowing that every second counted. Knowing, or perhaps not knowing, that they were sacrificing their health, their futures, possibly their lives. The Soviet government promised these men benefits, medical care, and recognition as heroes. Most never received any of it. Today, the surviving liquidators are scattered across former Soviet states, many suffering from cancers, heart disease, respiratory problems, and other radiation-related illnesses. Many live in poverty, their promised pensions and benefits never materialized or worth almost nothing after the Soviet collapse. The cleanup operation around Chernobyl involved dumping 5,000 tons of sand, lead, clay, and neutron-absorbing boron onto the burning reactor from helicopters. The helicopter pilots flew mission after mission through the radioactive plume rising from the reactor. These flights were supremely dangerous, not just from radiation but from the simple mechanics of flying. The intense heat rising from the reactor created severe turbulence. At least one helicopter crashed into the reactor building, killing its crew instantly. The radiation exposure to these pilots was extreme. Many died young. Many who survived deal with debilitating health conditions to this day. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the liquidator operation was the apparent willingness of Soviet authorities to use these men as human guinea pigs. There is evidence suggesting that some liquidators were deliberately sent into high radiation areas, not because the work was necessary, but because scientists wanted data on the effects of radiation on humans. The Soviet Union had been conducting research on radiation effects for decades, often using human subjects without their knowledge or consent. Chernobyl provided an unprecedented opportunity to study acute and chronic radiation exposure on a massive scale. Documents that emerged after the Soviet collapse revealed that detailed medical monitoring of liquidators was conducted, but this information was classified and never used to actually help the victims. Instead, it was compiled for research purposes, filed away in secret archives. The liquidators became unwitting subjects in one of the largest human radiation experiments in history. Their suffering, meticulously documented, became data points in classified reports. The evacuation of Pripyat, when it finally came 36 hours after the explosion, was presented as an orderly, temporary measure. Residents were told they would be gone for 3 days and to take only necessary items. This was another lie. The authorities knew that Pripyat would never be habitable again, but they didn't want panic. They wanted compliance. So 49,000 people were loaded onto buses, believing they would return, leaving behind their homes, their possessions, their pets, their entire lives. Many never even got to say goodbye properly. They never returned. Pripyat remains a ghost city, frozen in time, a monument to deception. But the evacuation zone was initially far too small. The Soviets established a 10-kilometer exclusion zone, then expanded it to 30 kilometers. But radiation doesn't respect arbitrary boundaries. Radioactive fallout spread according to wind patterns, weather conditions, and the whims of atmospheric dynamics. Some areas far outside the exclusion zone received massive contamination. Some areas inside were relatively less affected. The Soviet government knew this, as their radiation monitoring showed the complex contamination pattern, but they kept to simple circles on a map because it was easier administratively. Thousands of people in highly contaminated areas outside the exclusion zone were never evacuated. They continued living in villages where the radiation levels in some places exceeded those in parts of the exclusion zone. They farmed contaminated land, ate contaminated food, drank contaminated water, and breathed contaminated air. When scientists and doctors tried to sound the alarm about these populations, they were often silenced. The government didn't want to evacuate more people because it was expensive and complicated and would be an admission that the situation was worse than they had claimed. The contamination of the food supply was another dark secret. The radioactive fallout, particularly isotopes like iodine-131 and cesium-137, entered the food chain rapidly. Cows grazing on contaminated grass produced contaminated milk. This milk went into the dairy supply. Children, who are far more vulnerable to radiation than adults, consumed this milk in large quantities. The Soviet government knew this was happening. They had radiation monitoring data showing dangerous levels of radioactive iodine in milk supplies across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. They did not issue warnings. They did not recall contaminated products. They did not distribute iodine tablets, which could have protected children's thyroid glands from radioactive iodine. The result was a massive, preventable public health disaster. Thousands of children developed thyroid cancer in the years following Chernobyl, a type of cancer that is extremely rare in children under normal circumstances. The cluster of thyroid cancer cases in the contaminated regions was so statistically obvious that even the Soviet government couldn't hide it forever. But by the time they acknowledged the problem, the damage was done. These children, many now adults if they survived, bear the physical and emotional scars of a disaster that their government had the power to mitigate but chose not to. The international dimension of the cover-up is equally disturbing. As radioactive clouds drifted across Europe, Soviet officials said nothing. Sweden detected unusual radiation levels on April 28, 2 days after the explosion. They immediately suspected a nuclear accident and began investigating. Initially, they thought the problem might be at one of their own facilities. Only when they determined that their reactors were not the source did the investigation turn to the Soviet Union. The Soviets, when finally confronted with evidence they could not deny, admitted there had been an accident but minimized its severity. European governments, receiving radiation data showing significant contamination across the continent, faced their own dilemmas. How much should the official death toll from Chernobyl, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency and the World Health Organization, is fewer than 100 people. This figure is so absurdly low that it would be laughable if the reality weren't so tragic. This number counts only the plant workers and firefighters who died from acute radiation syndrome in the immediate aftermath. It ignores the liquidators who died young from cancers and other radiation-induced diseases. It ignores the children who developed thyroid cancer. It ignores the people who lived in contaminated areas and suffered elevated rates of leukemia, other cancers, heart disease, and immune disorders. It ignores the increased rates of birth defects and genetic damage in affected populations. Independent researchers have attempted to calculate the true death toll, and their estimates range from tens of thousands to potentially hundreds of thousands of excess deaths attributable to Chernobyl. The uncertainty in these numbers is often used to dismiss them, but this uncertainty exists precisely because the Soviet government and its successors have hidden data, destroyed records, and discouraged research that might reveal the full scale of the disaster. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of a cover-up. The construction of the sarcophagus, the massive concrete structure built to entomb Reactor 4, was another chapter in the story of human sacrifice. The structure had to be built adjacent to and partially atop the ruined reactor, in a radiation environment that was lethal. The workers who built it were exposed to enormous doses of radiation. The construction was rushed because every day the reactor remained exposed, more radiation escaped into the environment. Corners were cut. The sarcophagus was never meant to be a permanent solution, though it was often presented as such to the public. The sarcophagus was a triumph of engineering accomplished under impossible conditions, but it was also a ticking time bomb. It was constructed so hastily that structural weaknesses were built in from the start. Large cracks appeared within years. Rain leaked in, creating contaminated water that pooled beneath the reactor. The structure was never fully sealed, so radioactive dust continued to escape. Engineers warned that the sarcophagus could collapse, potentially causing another release of radioactive material. These warnings were ignored or kept secret for years because acknowledging the problem would mean admitting that Chernobyl was not safely contained, that the disaster was ongoing. It took until 2016, 30 years after the disaster, for a new containment structure to be completed. The new safe confinement, a massive arch larger than any movable structure ever built, was slid into place over the crumbling sarcophagus. This structure is designed to last 100 years, but the radioactive material inside will remain dangerous for tens of thousands of years. The new safe confinement is not a solution. It is a temporary measure, kicking the problem down the road for future generations to deal with. Inside the ruins of Reactor 4, in the basement levels flooded with contaminated water, there exists something that sounds like science fiction but is terrifying fact. When the reactor core melted down, the fuel, mixed with molten concrete, steel, and sand, flowed through the reactor building like lava. This radioactive lava, containing uranium, plutonium, and dozens of other radioactive isotopes, cooled and solidified into formations that have come to be called corium. The most famous of these formations, photographed by a camera on a timed remote device because no human could survive long enough to take the picture manually, is known as the elephant's foot. The elephant's foot is a mass of corium that formed in a corridor beneath the reactor. When it was first photographed in 1990, standing near it for 5 minutes would give you a lethal dose of radiation. 30 seconds of exposure would cause dizziness and fatigue. 2 minutes would cause radiation sickness. 5 minutes would result in death within days. The photographer who took the image used a mirror on a stick extended around a corner because directly viewing it was too dangerous. Even with this precaution, the radiation fogged the film, creating the grainy, distorted quality of the images. The corium formations throughout the reactor building contain an enormous amount of radioactive material, and no one knows their exact composition or condition. They remain buried in the rubble, impossible to examine closely, impossible to remove with current technology. If the sarcophagus had collapsed before the new safe confinement was built, these formations could have been exposed to the environment again. Even now, they represent a long-term hazard that has no solution. They are a permanent scar on the landscape, a radioactive monument that will outlast human civilization as we know it. The psychological and social costs of Chernobyl are immeasurable. Entire communities were destroyed, not just physically but culturally. The people evacuated from the exclusion zone became refugees in their own country. They were often stigmatized, treated as contaminated, feared by others who didn't understand radiation but knew enough to be afraid. Marriages broke up. Families were separated. The social fabric was torn apart. Many evacuees struggled with depression, anxiety, and a profound sense of loss. Some, particularly the elderly, never adjusted to their displacement. They had lost everything, not to war or natural disaster, but to an invisible poison and government negligence. The children born in the aftermath of Chernobyl in contaminated areas carry a particular burden. Studies have shown increased rates of birth defects, developmental disorders, and genetic abnormalities in these populations. The data is disputed, as data about Chernobyl always is, because acknowledging the full extent of genetic damage would have profound implications. It would mean admitting that the disaster did not end in 1986, that it continues to echo through generations. It would mean acknowledging that the human genome itself was damaged, that the descendants of those exposed carry mutations that may affect their children and grandchildren. The wildlife in the exclusion zone has become another subject of bitter debate and disturbing revelations. After humans evacuated, wildlife populations in the zone exploded. Without human presence, animals thrived. Images of wild horses, wolves, bears, and even lynx in the abandoned streets of Pripyat have been used to paint a picture of nature's resilience, of life reclaiming a dead zone. This narrative is comforting but misleading. The animals in the exclusion zone are not thriving in any normal sense. They are surviving, but they are contaminated. Studies of these animals show elevated mutation rates, shorter lifespans, higher incidences of tumors and abnormalities, and reduced fertility. Birds in the exclusion zone have been found to have smaller brains and elevated rates of albinism and other mutations. Rodents show genetic damage that persists across generations. The forests themselves are contaminated to their roots. Trees absorb radioactive isotopes from the soil, concentrating them. When these trees die and fall, they don't decay normally because the bacteria and fungi that decompose organic matter are themselves damaged by radiation. The result is an accumulation of dead wood, a massive fire hazard. If a forest fire were to sweep through the exclusion zone, it could send radioactive particles into the atmosphere again, creating a secondary contamination event. This nearly happened in 2020 when massive fires burned through the exclusion zone. Radiation levels in Kiev, over 100 kilometers away, spiked measurably. Firefighters battled the blazes, once again exposing themselves to radiation to protect others. The fires burned for weeks, consuming contaminated forest, turning radioactive materials into smoke and ash that spread across the region. This event received some international media attention, but nothing like it deserved. The world had moved on from Chernobyl. The fact that it remains an active threat more than 3 decades later doesn't fit the narrative of a disaster that ended long ago. The political implications of Chernobyl contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself, though this is rarely framed as part of the disaster's dark truth. Mikhail Gorbachev later stated that Chernobyl was perhaps the real cause of the Soviet collapse, more than any political or economic factor. The disaster exposed the rot at the heart of the Soviet system, the incompetence, the corruption, the willingness to sacrifice citizens for political convenience, the reflexive secrecy, and the inability to respond effectively to crisis. The people of the Soviet Union, learning piece by piece how badly they had been lied to about Chernobyl, lost faith in their government in a way that could not be restored. But even as the Soviet Union collapsed, the lying continued. Documents were destroyed. Files were classified or lost. Scientists who wanted to study the health effects of Chernobyl were denied access to data or to affected populations. The successor states to the Soviet Union, particularly Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, had neither the resources nor, often, the political will to fully investigate and address the consequences of Chernobyl. International organizations, despite good intentions, often relied on data provided by these governments, data that was incomplete, manipulated, or simply false. The International Atomic Energy Agency, tasked with promoting nuclear energy as well as ensuring safety, faced an inherent conflict of interest in assessing Chernobyl. Acknowledging the full scale of the disaster could undermine nuclear energy programs worldwide. Their assessments have consistently minimized the health impacts, relying on narrow definitions of what counts as a Chernobyl-related death or illness. This has led to bitter disputes with independent scientists, doctors working with affected populations, and victims advocates who see the human cost firsthand and know that the official numbers are a fiction. Medical research on Chernobyl survivors and liquidators has been hampered by lack of funding, political interference, and the sheer complexity of radiation health effects. Low-level chronic radiation exposure doesn't kill quickly or obviously. It increases cancer risk, damages immune systems, accelerates aging, and causes a constellation of health problems that are difficult to definitively link to radiation. A liquidator who develops leukemia 15 years after his service cannot prove that Chernobyl caused his cancer, but the statistical excess of such cancers in liquidator populations tells a clear story. Yet because individual causation cannot be proven, many victims have been denied compensation and recognition. The economic cost of Chernobyl is staggering and ongoing. The immediate costs of the disaster response, evacuation, and initial cleanup ran into billions of dollars. The construction of the sarcophagus and later the new safe confinement added billions more. The lost economic productivity of the exclusion zone, which includes not just the area around the reactor but thousands of square kilometers of abandoned farmland, forests, and villages, represents a permanent economic loss. The healthcare costs for treating victims continue to accumulate. Belarus, which received about 70% of the fallout from Chernobyl, has estimated that it will spend decades of GDP on Chernobyl-related costs. This is money that could have gone to education, infrastructure, and development, instead consumed by the consequences of a disaster that should never have happened. The reactor design itself was flawed in ways that Soviet officials knew about before the disaster. The RBMK reactor type used at Chernobyl had a design flaw that could cause a power surge under certain conditions. This flaw was known to Soviet nuclear scientists. Modifications had been recommended. Some other RBMK reactors had been modified to address the issue. But Chernobyl's Reactor 4 had not been upgraded because it was deemed too expensive and disruptive. The safety test being conducted on the night of the disaster was supposed to address a different safety concern about the reactor's ability to provide power during an emergency shutdown, but the test itself violated multiple safety protocols. The operators conducting the test disabled safety systems, reduced the reactor power to unstable levels, and overrode automatic safety mechanisms. This is often cited as operator error, and it certainly was, but these operators were working in a culture that prioritized production and meeting targets over safety. They were inadequately trained on the specific risks of the RBMK reactor design. They were pressured to complete the test before a scheduled maintenance shutdown. The supervisors approving the test procedures were not nuclear scientists but Communist Party officials concerned with meeting production quotas and advancement. The disaster was not just a result of the mistakes made that night but of systemic failures in Soviet industrial culture, regulatory oversight, and political priorities. After the disaster, as the Soviet government scrambled to assign blame, the operators who survived were put on trial. They were convicted and imprisoned, made scapegoats for a disaster that had causes reaching far beyond their actions. The chief engineer and the deputy chief engineer of the plant were sentenced to 10 years in labor camps. These men certainly bore responsibility for their decisions that night, but they were products of a system that set them up to fail. The reactor designers, the officials who decided not to upgrade the safety systems, the bureaucrats who created a culture where safety concerns were dismissed or punished, faced no consequences. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Chernobyl disaster is how it has been used as a tool in political and economic agendas that have nothing to do with the victims or their well-being. The Soviet government used Chernobyl to deflect from other failures, to test civil defense and disaster response capabilities, and to gather scientific data. After the Soviet collapse, Chernobyl became a tool for various factions seeking international aid, making territorial claims, or advancing political positions. The suffering of Chernobyl victims has been exploited repeatedly by people and organizations with their own agendas. The nuclear industry worldwide has used Chernobyl as an example of what not to do, painting it as a uniquely Soviet failure that could never happen with Western reactor designs and safety cultures. This narrative served to protect the nuclear industry from the more fundamental questions Chernobyl raises about the wisdom of nuclear energy. While Western reactors certainly have different designs and safety features, the idea that such a disaster could never happen elsewhere is dangerous hubris. Fukushima proved this. The fundamental truth that Chernobyl reveals is that when nuclear technology fails, it can fail catastrophically, and the consequences can be beyond our ability to manage or repair. In the exclusion zone today, tourists visit in increasing numbers. Chernobyl has become a dark tourism destination, where people pay to walk through Pripyat, to see the abandoned amusement park with its rusting Ferris wheel, to stand in empty schools and hospitals frozen in time. These tours are carefully managed, following routes where radiation levels are relatively low, limited in duration to minimize exposure. Tour guides deliver well-rehearsed narratives about the disaster. But this commodification of Chernobyl, turning tragedy into entertainment, feels like yet another form of exploitation. The tourists take their photographs, experience their thrills at being in a forbidden zone, and leave. They receive doses of radiation that are statistically insignificant, probably less than they would get from a few extra airplane flights. They see the physical ruins but cannot see the radiation, cannot feel it, cannot truly comprehend it. They hear about the disaster but in a sanitized, packaged form. The real horror of Chernobyl cannot be captured in a day trip. It exists in hospital wards and graveyards, in classified documents and suppressed research, in the bodies of the liquidators and the tears of mothers who lost children to cancers that should never have occurred. There are still workers at Chernobyl, even now. The facility, though Reactor 4 was destroyed, had 3 other reactors that continued operating after the disaster. Reactor 2 was shut down after a fire in 1991. Reactor 1 was shut down in 1996. Reactor 3, sharing a building with the destroyed Reactor 4, incredibly continued operating until the year 2000. Workers would commute into the exclusion zone, work shifts maintaining or decommissioning reactors in the shadow of the sarcophagus, and then leave again. Today, workers continue to monitor the site, maintain the new safe confinement, and slowly work toward a final decommissioning that will take decades if not longer. These workers accumulate radiation exposure. They work in an environment that, while much safer than it was in 1986, remains contaminated. They are the modern liquidators, though better protected and better informed than their predecessors. They do necessary work, but one wonders about the long-term health studies being conducted on this population, about whether they truly understand the risks they face, about whether they have real choices or whether economic necessity drives them to accept work others would refuse. The soil in the exclusion zone will remain contaminated for centuries. Plutonium-239, one of the isotopes released in the disaster, has a half-life of over 24,000 years. Even after 10 half-lives, when the radiation has decreased to less than 1/10 of its original level, over 240,000 years will have passed. Human civilization as we know it has existed for perhaps 10,000 years. The radioactive legacy of Chernobyl will outlast the memory of what caused it, will persist long after our languages are dead and our cities have crumbled to dust. This is perhaps the ultimate dark truth of Chernobyl. We have created a problem that we cannot solve, only contain, and that containment must be maintained far beyond any reasonable planning horizon. The new safe confinement is designed to last 100 years. Then what? Another structure must be built. And after that? And after that? For as long as human civilization exists in any form capable of such work, Chernobyl must be tended to, guarded, maintained. It is a burden we have imposed not just on ourselves but on every generation that will follow us. The attempts to forget Chernobyl, to move on, to minimize its significance, are understandable human reactions to an unbearable reality. But they are also dangerous. The lessons of Chernobyl are written in blood and suffering, and if we do not learn them, we are doomed to repeat them. The lesson is not simply about nuclear reactor design or operator training or emergency response, though all of those matter. The deeper lesson is about the relationship between technology, power, and truth. When those in power prioritize their own interests over public safety, when they lie to protect themselves and their institutions, when they treat human lives as expendable resources, catastrophe follows. Chernobyl happened because people in power made choices, conscious deliberate choices, that they knew put others at risk. The reactor design flaws were known and not addressed. The safety test was conducted in violation of protocols. The emergency response was delayed to avoid political embarrassment. The evacuation was postponed to prevent panic that might reflect badly on authorities. The liquidators were sent into deadly radiation with inadequate protection to save money and time. The data on health effects was suppressed to avoid liability and maintain the reputation of nuclear power. At every step, from the decisions made decades before the explosion to the ongoing management of the disaster today, the pattern repeats: those in power protect themselves and their interests while those without power suffer the consequences. This is the dark truth of Chernobyl. It was not an accident in any meaningful sense. It was a crime of negligence, of arrogance, of prioritizing power and profit over human life and health. And it is a crime that continues to this day in every suppressed study, every minimized death toll, every victim denied recognition and compensation, every attempt to declare Chernobyl safely contained and move on while radioactive material continues to leak and people continue to sicken and die. The ghosts of Chernobyl demand that we remember, that we acknowledge the full truth of what happened and why, that we honor the sacrifices of those who were sent to fight an invisible enemy without adequate weapons or protection, that we care for the victims and their descendants, and that we commit ourselves to never allowing such a disaster to happen again. But that commitment requires more than technical improvements or safety regulations. It requires a fundamental rejection of the mindset that allowed Chernobyl to happen, the mindset that treats people as expendable, that values power and reputation over truth and safety, that believes some truths are too dangerous or inconvenient to be told. Chernobyl is not over. It will not be over in our lifetimes or our grandchildren's lifetimes. The radioactive fire may have been extinguished decades ago, but the consequences continue to burn through lives and communities and generations. The exclusion zone will remain a scar on the landscape for longer than human history has yet run. The victims, the known and the unknown, the counted and the uncounted, the acknowledged and the denied, deserve more than our brief attention and our shallow understanding. They deserve the truth, all of it, no matter how dark, no matter how disturbing, no matter how inconvenient for those who would prefer we forget and move on. This is the dark truth of Chernobyl.